resurrection, and death. It is possible I already had some presentiment of my future. The locked and rusted gate that stood before us, with wisps of river fog threading its spikes like the mountain paths, remains in my mind now as the symbol of my exile. That is why I have begun this account of it with the aftermath of our swim, in which I, the torturer's apprentice Severian, had so nearly drowned. The guard has gone. Thus my friend Roche spoke to 𝙁, who had already seen it for himself. Doubtfully, the boy 𝙰 suggested that we go around. A lift of his thin, freckled arm indicated the thousands of paces of wall stretching across the slum and sweeping up the hill, until at last they met the high curtain wall of the citadel. It was a walk I would take much later. And try to get through the Barbican without a safe conduct. They'd send to Master Gerlos. But why would the guard leave? It doesn't matter. 𝙁 rattled the gate. 𝙰, see if you can slip between the bars. 𝙁 was our captain, and 𝙰 put an arm and a leg through the iron palings, but it was immediately clear that there was no hope of his getting his body to follow. Someone's coming, Roche whispered. 𝙁 jerked 𝙰 out. I looked down the street. Lanterns swung there among the fog-muffled sounds of feet and voices. I would have hidden, but Roche held me, saying, "Wait, I see pikes." "Do you think it's the guard returning?" He shook his head. "Too many." "A dozen men at least," 𝙁 said. Still wet from guile, we waited. In the recesses of my mind, we stand shivering there even now. Just as all that appears imperishable tends toward its own destruction, those moments, that at the time seemed the most fleeting, recreate themselves, not only in my memory, which in the final accounting loses nothing, but in the throbbing of my heart and the prickling of my hair, making themselves new, just as our commonwealth reconstitutes itself each morning in the shrill tones of its own clarions. The men had no armor, as I could soon see by the sickly yellow light of the lanterns, but they had pikes, as 𝙁 had said, and staves and hatchets. Their leader wore a long, double-edged knife in his belt. What interested me more was the massive key threaded on a cord around his neck. It looked as if it might fit the lock of the gate. Little 𝙰 fidgeted with nervousness, and the leader saw us and lifted his lantern over his head. "We're waiting to get in, good man," 𝙁 called. He was the taller, but he made his dark face humble and respectful. "Not until dawn," the leader said gruffly. "You young fellows had better get home." "Good man, the guard was supposed to let us in, but he's not here." "You won't be getting in tonight." The leader put his hand on the hilt of his knife before taking a step closer. For a moment, I was afraid he knew who we were. 𝙁 moved away, and the rest of us stayed behind him. "Who are you, good man? You're not soldiers." "We're the volunteers," one of the others said. "We come to protect our own dead." "Then you can let us in." The leader had turned away. "We let no one inside but ourselves." His key squealed in the lock, and the gate creaked back. Before anyone could stop him, 𝙰 darted through. Someone cursed, and the leader and 2 others sprinted after 𝙰, but he was too fleet for them. We saw his tow-colored hair and patched shirt zigzag among the sunken graves of paupers, then disappear in the thicket of statuary higher up. 𝙁 tried to pursue him, but 2 men grabbed his arms. "We have to find him. We won't rob you of your dead." "Why do you want to go in, then?" one volunteer asked. "To gather herbs," Ďrot told him. "We are physicians Gallipots. Don't you want the sick healed?" The volunteer stared at him. The man with the key had dropped his lantern when he ran after Ita, and there were only 2 left. In their dim light, the volunteer looked stupid and innocent. I suppose he was a laborer of some kind. Ďrot continued. "You must know that for certain simples to attain their highest virtues, they must be pulled from grave soil by moonlight. It will frost soon and kill everything. But our masters require supplies for the winter. The 3 of them arranged for us to enter tonight, and I borrowed that lad from his father to help me." "You don't have anything to put simples in." I still admire Ďrot for what he did next. He said, "We are to bind them in sheaves to dry," and without the least hesitation, drew a length of common string from his pocket. "I see," the volunteer said. It was plain he did not. Rosh and I edged nearer the gate. Ďrot actually stepped back from it. "If you won't let us gather the herbs, we'd better go. I don't think we could ever find that boy in there now." "No, you don't. We have to get him out." "All right," Ďrot said reluctantly, and we stepped through, the volunteers following. Certain mysts aver that the real world has been constructed by the human mind. Since our ways are governed by the artificial categories into which we place, essentially, undifferentiated things, things weaker than our words for them. I understood the principle intuitively that night, as I heard the last volunteer swing the gate closed behind us. A man who had not spoken before said, "I'm going to watch over my mother. We've wasted too much time already. They could have her a league off by now." Several of the others muttered agreement, and the group began to scatter, one lantern moving to the left and the other to the right. We went up the center path, the one we always took in returning to the fallen section of the citadel wall with the remaining volunteers. It is my nature, my joy, and my curse, to forget nothing. Every rattling chain and whistling wind, every sight, smell, and taste remains changeless in my mind. And though I know it is not so with everyone, I cannot imagine what it can mean to be otherwise, as if one had slept, when in fact an experience is merely remote. Those few steps we took upon the whited path rise before me now. It was cold and growing colder. We had no light, and fog had begun to roll in from Gaiol in earnest. A few birds had come to roost in the pines and cypresses and flapped uneasily from tree to tree. I remember the feel of my own hands as I rubbed my arms, and the lantern bobbing among the steelies some distance off, and how the fog brought out the smell of the river water in my shirt and the pungency of the new-turned earth. I had almost died that day, choking in the netted roots. The night was to mark the beginning of my manhood. There was a shot, a thing I had never seen before, the bolt of violet energy splitting the darkness like a wedge, so that it closed with a thunderclap. Somewhere a monument fell with a crash. Silence then, in which everything around me seemed to dissolve. We began to run. Men were shouting far off. I heard the ring of steel on stone, as if someone had struck one of the grave markers with a battle air. I dashed along a path that was, or at least then seemed, completely unfamiliar. A ribbon of broken bone, just wide enough for 2 to walk abreast, that wound down into a little dale. In the fog I could see nothing but the dark bulk of the memorials to either side. Then, As suddenly as if it had been snatched away, the path was no longer beneath my feet. I suppose I must have failed to notice some turning. I swerved to dodge an obelisk that appeared to shoot up before me and collided full tilt with a man in a black coat. He was solid as a tree. The impact took me off my feet and knocked my breath away. I heard him muttering execrations, then a whispering sound as he swung some weapon. Another voice called, "What was that?" "Somebody ran into me. Gone now, whoever he was." I lay still. A woman said, "Open the lamp." Her voice was like a dove's call, but there was urgency in it. The man I had run against answered, "They would be on us like a pack of dolls, madame." "They will be soon in any case. Vodalus fired. You must have heard it." "Be more likely to keep them off." In an accent I was too inexperienced to recognize as an exultance, the man who had spoken first said, "I wish I hadn't brought it. We shouldn't need it against this sort of people." He was much nearer now, and in a moment I could see him through the fog, very tall, slender, and hatless, standing near the heavier man I had run into. Muffled in black, a third figure was apparently the woman. In losing my wind, I had also lost the strength of my limbs, but I managed to roll behind the base of a statue, and once secure there, I peered out at them again. My eyes had grown accustomed to the dark. I could distinguish the woman's heart-shaped face and note that she was nearly as tall as the slender man she had called Vodalus. The heavy man had disappeared, but I heard him say, "More rope." His voice indicated that he was no more than a step or two away from the spot where I crouched. But he seemed to have vanished, like water cast into a well. Then I saw something dark. It must have been the crown of his hat, move near the slender man's feet, and understood that that was almost precisely what had become of him. There was a hole there, and he was in it. The woman asked, "How is she?" "Fresh as a flower, madame. Hardly a breath of stink on her, and nothing to worry about." More agilely than I would have thought possible, he sprang out. "Now give me one end and you take the other, liege, and we'll have her out like a carrot." The woman said something I could not hear, and the slender man told her, "You didn't have to come, Thea. How would it look to the others if I took none of the risks?" He and the heavy man grunted as they pulled, and I saw something white appear at their feet. They bent to lift it, as though an ๊amshaspanդ had touched them with his radiant wand. The fog swirled and parted to let a beam of green moonlight fall. They had the corpse of a woman. Her hair, which had been dark, was in some disorder now about her livid face. She wore a long gown of some pale fabric. "You see," the heavy man said, "just as I told you, liege, madame, 19 times of a score there's nothing to it. We've only to get her over the wall now." The words were no sooner out of his mouth than I heard someone shout. 3 of the volunteers were coming down the path over the rim of the dale. "Hold them off, liege," the heavy man growled, shouldering the corpse. "I'll take care of this, and get madame to safety." "Take it," Vodalus said. The pistol he handed over caught the moonlight like a mirror. The heavy man gaped at it. "I've never used one, liege." "Take it. You may need it." Vodalus stopped, then rose holding what appeared to be a dark stick. There was a rattle of metal on wood, and in place of the stick, a bright and narrow blade. He called, "Guard yourselves!" as if a dove had momentarily commanded an art-author. The woman took the shining pistol from the heavy man's hand, and together they backed into the fog. The 3 volunteers had hesitated. Now one moved to the right and another to the left, so as to attack from 3 sides. The man in the center, still on the white path of broken bones, had a pike, and one of the others an axe. The third was the leader Ďrot had spoken with outside the gate. "Who are you?" he called to Vodalus. "And what power of Erebus's gives you the right to come here and do something like this?" Vodalus did not reply, but the point of his sword looked from one to another like an eye. The leader grated. "All together now and we'll have him." But they advanced hesitantly, and before they could close, Vodalus sprang forward. I saw his blade flash in the faint light, and heard it scrape the head of the pike, a metallic slithering, as though a steel serpent glided across a log of iron. The pikeman yelled and jumped back. Vodalus leaped backward too, I think for fear the other 2 would get behind him, then seemed to lose his balance and fell. All this took place in dark and fog. I saw it, but for the most part the men were no more than ambient shadows, as the woman with the heart-shaped face had been. Yet something touched me. Perhaps it was Vodalus's willingness to die to protect her that made the woman seem precious to me. Certainly, it was that willingness that kindled my admiration for him. Many times since then, when I have stood upon a shaky platform in some marketplace square, with Terminus Est at rest before me, and a miserable vagrant kneeling at my feet, when I have heard in hissing whispers the hate of the crowd, and sensed what was far less welcome, the admiration of those who find an unclean joy in pains and deaths not their own, I have recalled Vodalus at the graveside, and raised my own blade, half pretending that when it fell, I would be striking for him. He stumbled, as I have said. In that instant, I believe, my whole life teetered in the scales with his. The flanking volunteers ran toward him, but he had held onto his weapon. I saw the bright blade flash up, though its owner was still on the ground. I remember thinking what a fine thing it would have been to have had such a sword on the day Ďrot became captain of apprentices, and then likening Vodalus to myself. The axeman, toward whom he had thrust, drew back. The other drove forward with his long knife. I was on my feet by then, watching the fight over the shoulder of a Chalcedony angel, and I saw the knife come down, missing Vodalus by a thumb's width as he writhed away, and burying itself to the hilt in the ground. Vodalus slashed at the leader then, but he was too near for the length of his blade. The leader, instead of backing off, released his weapon and clutched him like a wrestler. They were at the very edge of the opened grave. I suppose Vodalus had tripped over the soil excavated from it. The second volunteer raised his axe, then hesitated. His leader was nearest him. He circled to get a clear stroke, until he was less than a pace from where I hid. While he shifted his ground, I saw Vodalus wrench the knife free and drive it into the leader's throat. The axe rose to strike. I grasped the helve just below the head almost by reflex, and found myself at once in the struggle, kicking, then striking. Quite suddenly, it was over. The volunteer, whose bloodied weapon I held, was dead. The leader of the volunteers was writhing at our feet. The pikeman was gone. His pike lay harmlessly across the path. Vodalus retrieved a black wand from the grass nearby and sheathed his sword in it. "Who are you?" "Severian. I am a torturer. Or rather, I am an apprentice of the Torturer's Liege, of the Order of the Seekers for Truth and Penitence." I drew a deep breath. I am a vodalarius, one of the thousands of vodalariae of whose existence you are unaware. It was a term I had scarcely heard. Here. He laid something in my palm, a small coin, so smooth it seemed greased. I remained clutching it beside the violeted grave and watched him stride away. The fog swallowed him long before he reached the rim, and a few moments later, a silver flyer, as sharp as a dart, screamed overhead. The knife had somehow fallen from the dead man's neck. Perhaps he had pulled it out in his agony. When I bent to pick it up, I discovered that the coin was still in my hand and thrust it into my pocket. We believe that we invent symbols. The truth is that they invent us. We are their creatures, shaped by their hard, defining edges. When soldiers take their oath, they are given a coin, an ázimai stamped with the profile of the autarch. Their acceptance of that coin is their acceptance of the special duties and burdens of military life. They are soldiers from that moment, though they may know nothing of the management of arms. I did not know that then, but it is a profound mistake to believe that we must know of such things to be influenced by them. And in fact, to believe so is to believe in the most debased and superstitious kind of magic. The would-be sorcerer alone has faith in the efficacy of pure knowledge. Rational people know that things act of themselves or not at all. Thus I knew nothing, as the coin dropped into my pocket, of the dogmas of the movement Vodalis led. But I soon learned them all, for they were in the air. With him I hated the autarchy, though I had no notion of what might replace it. With him I despised the exultants who failed to rise against the autarch, and bound the fairest of their daughters to him in ceremonial concubinage. With him I detested the people for their lack of discipline and a common purpose. Of those values that Master Malrubius, who had been master of apprentices when I was a boy, had tried to teach me, and that Master Palimon still tried to impart, I accepted only one: loyalty to the guild. In that I was quite correct. It was, as I sensed, perfectly feasible for me to serve Vodalis and remain a torturer. It was in this fashion that I began the long journey by which I have backed into the throne. Chapter 2. Severian. Memory oppresses me. Having been reared among the torturers, I have never known my father or my mother, nor did my brother apprentices know theirs. From time to time, but most particularly when winter draws on, poor wretches come clamoring to the corpse door, hoping to be admitted to our ancient guild. Often they regale Brother Porter with accounts of the torments they will willingly inflict in payment for warmth and food. Occasionally they fetch animals as samples of their work. All are turned away. Traditions from our days of glory, antedating the present degenerate age and the one before it, and the one before that, an age whose name is hardly remembered now by scholars, forbid recruitment from such as they. Even at the time I write of, when the guild had shrunk to 2 masters and less than a score of journeymen, those traditions were honored. From my earliest memory I remember all. That first recollection is of piling pebbles in the old yard. It lies south and west of the Witches' Keep, and is separated from the Grand Court. The curtain wall our guild was to help defend was ruinous even then, with a wide gap between the Red Tower and the Bear, where I used to climb the fallen slabs of unsmeltable gray metal to look out over the necropolis that descends that side of Citadel Hill. When I was older, it became my playground. The winding paths were patrolled during daylight hours, but the sentries were largely concerned for the fresher graves on the lower ground, and knowing us to belong to the torturers, they seldom had much stomach for expelling us from our lurking places in the cypress groves. Our necropolis is said to be the oldest in Nessus. That is certainly false, but the very existence of the error testifies to a real antiquity, though the autarchs were not buried there, even when the citadel was their stronghold, and the great families, then as now, preferred to inter their long-limbed dead in vaults on their own estates. But the armigers and optimates of the city favored the highest slopes, near the citadel wall, and the poorer commons lay below them until the farthest reaches of the bottom lands, pressing against the tenements that came to line Gaiol, held potters' fields. As a boy, I seldom went so far alone, or half so far. There were always the three of us, Drott, Roche, and I. Later, Ita, the next oldest among the apprentices. None of us were born among the torturers, for none are. It is said that in ancient times there were both men and women in the guild, and that sons and daughters were born to them and brought up in the mystery, as is now the case among the lamp makers and the goldsmiths and many other guilds. But Ymar the Almost Just, observing how cruel the women were, and how often they exceeded the punishments he had decreed, ordered that there should be women among the torturers no more. Since that time, our numbers have been repaired solely from the children of those who fall into our hands. In our Matachin tower, a certain bar of iron thrusts from a bulkhead at the height of a man's groin. Male children, small enough to stand upright beneath it, are nurtured as our own, and when a woman big with child is sent to us, we open her, and if the babe draws breath, engage a wet nurse if it be a boy. The females are rendered to the witches. So it has been since the days of Ymar, and those days are now by many hundreds of years forgotten. Thus none of us knows our descent. Each would be an exultant if he could, and it is a fact that many persons of high lineage are given over to us. As boys, each of us formed his own conjectures, and each attempted to question the older brothers among the journeymen, though they were locked in their own bitterness and told us little. Ita, believing himself descended of that family, drew the arms of one of the great northern clans on the ceiling above his cot, in the year of which I speak. For my part, I had already adopted as my own the devices graved in bronze above the door of a certain mausoleum. They were a fountain rising above waters, and a ship volant, and below these a rose. The door itself had been sprung long ago. 2 empty coffins lay on the floor. 3 more, too heavy for me to shift and still intact, waited on the shelves along one wall. Neither the closed coffins nor the open ones constituted the attraction of the place, though I sometimes rested on what remained of the soft faded padding of the latter. Rather, it was the smallness of the room, the thick walls of masonry, and the single narrow window with its one bar, together with the faithless door, so massively heavy, that remained eternally ajar. Through window and door, I could look out unseen on all the bright life of tree and shrub and grass outside. The linnets and rabbits that fled when I approached could neither hear nor scent me there. I watched the storm crow build her nest and rear her young 2 cubits from my face. I saw the fox trot by with upraised brush, and once that giant fox, taller than all but the tallest hounds, that men call the maned wolf, loped by at dusk on some unguessable errand from the ruined quarters of the south. The karakara coursed vipers for me, and the hawk lifted his wings to the wind from the top of a pine. A moment suffices to describe these things, for which I watched so long. The decades of Asaros would not be long enough for me to write all they meant to the ragged apprentice boy I was. Two thoughts that were nearly dreams obsessed me and made them infinitely precious. The first was that, at some not distant time, time itself would stop. The colored days that had so long been drawn forth like a chain of conjurer's scarves come to an end. The sullen sun wink out at last. The second was that there existed somewhere a miraculous light, which I sometimes conceived of as a candle, sometimes as a flambeau, that engendered life in whatever objects it fell upon, so that a leaf plucked from a bush grew slender legs and waving feelers, and a rough brown brush opened black eyes and scurried up a tree. Yet sometimes, particularly in the sleepy hours around noon, there was little to watch. Then I turned again to the blazon over the door and wondered what a ship, a rose, and a fountain had to do with me, and stared at the funeral bronze I had found and cleaned and set up in a corner. The dead man lay at full length, his heavy-lidded eyes closed. In the light that pierced the little window, I examined his face and meditated on my own as I saw it in the polished metal. My straight nose, deep-set eyes, and sunken cheeks were much like his, and I longed to know if he too had dark hair. In the winter, I seldom came to the necropolis, but in summer, that violated mausoleum and others provided me with places of observation and cool repose. Ďrāt and Rosh and Ita came too, though I never guided them to my favorite retreat, and they, I knew, had secret places of their own. When we were together, we seldom crept into tombs at all. Instead, we made swords of sticks and held running battles, or threw pine cones at the soldiers, or scratched boards on the soil of new graves, and played draughts with stones, and ropes and snails and high-toss cockle. We amused ourselves in the maze that was the citadel too, and swam in the great cistern under the bell-keep. It was cold and damp there, even in summer, under its vaulted ceiling, beside the circular pool of endlessly deep, dark water. But it was hardly worse in winter, and it had the supreme advantage of being forbidden, so we could slip down to it with delicious stealth when we were assumed to be elsewhere, and not kindle our torches until we had closed the barred hatch behind us. Then, when the flames shot up from the burning pitch, how our shadows danced up those clammy walls. As I have already mentioned, our other swimming place was in ģiāl, which winds through Nessus like a great weary snake. When warm weather came, we trooped through the necropolis on our way there. First past the old exalted sepulchres nearest the citadel wall, then between the vainglorious death houses of the Optimates, then through the stony forest of common monuments, we trying to appear highly respectable when we had to pass the burly guards leaning on their polearms, and at last across the plain bare mounds that marked the interments of the poor, mounds that sank to puddles after the first rain. At the lowest margin of the necropolis stood the iron gate I have already described. Through it, the bodies intended for the potter's field were borne. When we passed those rusting portals, we felt we were for the first time truly outside the citadel, and thus in undeniable disobedience of the rules that were supposed to govern our comings and goings. We believed, or pretended to believe, we would be tortured if our older brothers discovered the violation. In actuality, we would have suffered nothing worse than a beating. Such is the kindness of the torturers, whom I was subsequently to betray. We were in greater danger from the inhabitants of the many-storied tenements that lined the filthy street down which we walked. I sometimes think The reason the guild has endured so long is that it serves as a focus for the hatred of the people, drawing it from the autarch, the exultants, and the army, and even in some degree from the pale Caucasians who sometimes visit Earth from the farther stars. The same presentment that told the guards our identity often seemed to inform the residents of the tenements. Slops were thrown at us from upper windows occasionally, and an angry mutter followed us. But the fear that engendered this hatred also protected us. No real violence was done to us, and once or twice, when it was known that some tyrannical Wildgrave or venal Burgess had been delivered to the mercy of the guild, we received shouted suggestions as to his disposal, most of them obscene and many impossible. At the place where we swam, ĝāyol had lost its natural banks hundreds of years ago. Here it was, a 2-chain-wide expanse of blue nenuphars, penned between walls of stone. Steps intended for boat landings led down into the river at several points. On a warm day, each flight would be held by a gang of 10 or 15 brawling youths. The 4 of us lacked the strength to displace these groups, but they could not, or at least would not, deny us admission, though whichever we chose to join would threaten us as we approached and taunt us when we were in their midst. Soon, however, all would drift away, leaving us in sole possession until the next swimming day. I have chosen to describe all this now because I never went again after the day on which I saved Vodalis. ģāyol believed it was because I was afraid we would be locked out. Ita guessed, I think. Before they come too near to being men, boys often have an almost female insight. It was because of the nenuphars. The necropolis has never seemed a city of death to me. I know its purple roses, which other people think so hideous, shelter hundreds of small animals and birds. The executions I have seen performed, and have performed myself, so often are no more than a trade. A butchery of human beings who are, for the most part, less innocent and less valuable than cattle. When I think of my own death, or of the death of someone who has been kind to me, or even of the death of the sun, the image that comes to my mind is that of the nenuphar, with its glossy pale leaves and azure flower. Under flower and leaves are black roots as fine and strong as hair, reaching down into the dark waters. As young men, we thought nothing of these plants. We splashed and floated among them, pushed them aside and ignored them. Their perfume countered, to some degree, the foul odor of the water. On the day I was to save Vodalis, I dove beneath their crowded paths, as I had done 1,000 times. I did not come up. Somehow, I had entered a region where the roots seemed far thicker than I had ever encountered them before. I was caught in 100 nets at once. My eyes were open, but I could see nothing, only the black web of the roots. I swam and could feel that though my arms and legs moved among their millions of fine tendrils, my body did not. I grasped them by the handful and tore them apart, but when I had torn them, I was immobilized as ever. My lungs seemed to rise in my throat to choke me, as if they would burst of themselves out into the water. The desire to draw breath, to suck in the dark, cold fluid around me was overwhelming. I no longer knew in what direction the surface lay, and I was no longer conscious of the water as water. The strength had left my limbs. I was no longer afraid, though I knew I was dying, or perhaps already dead. There was a loud and very unpleasant ringing in my ears, and I began to see visions. Master Malrubius, who had died several years before, was waking us by drumming on the bulkhead with a spoon. That was the metallic din I heard. I lay in my cot, unable to rise, though Ďrot and Rosh and the younger boys were all up, yawning and fumbling for their clothes. Master Malrubius's cloak was thrown back. I could see the loose skin of his chest and belly, where the muscle and fat had been destroyed by time. There was a triangle of hair there, and it was as gray as mildew. I tried to call to him to tell him I was awake, but I could make no sound. He began to walk along the bulkhead, still striking it with his spoon. After what seemed a very long time, he reached the port, stopped and leaned out. I knew he was looking for me in the old yard below. Yet he could not see far enough. I was in one of the cells below the examination room. I lay there on my back, looking up at the gray ceiling. A woman cried, but I could not see her, and I was less conscious of her sobs than of the ringing, ringing, ringing of the spoon. Darkness closed over me, but out of the darkness came the face of a woman, as immense as the green face of the moon. It was not she who wept. I could hear the sob still, and this face was untroubled, and indeed filled with that kind of beauty that hardly admits of expression. Her hands reached toward me, and I at once became a fledgling I had taken from its nest the year before in the hope of taming it to perch on my finger. For her hands were each as long as the coffins in which I sometimes rested in my secret mausoleum. They grasped me, pulled me up, then flung me down, away from her face and from the sound of sobbing, down into the blackness, until at last I struck what I took to be the bottom mud and burst through it into a world of light rimmed with black. Still I could not breathe. I no longer wished to, and my chest no longer moved of itself. I was sliding through the water, though I did not know how. Later I learned that Ďrot had seized me by the hair. At once I lay on the cold, slimy stones with Rosh, then Ďrot, then Rosh again, breathing into my mouth. I was enveloped in eyes, as one is enveloped in the repetitious patterns of a kaleidoscope, and thought that some defect in my own vision was multiplying Ida's eyes. At last I pulled away from Rosh and vomited great quantities of black water. After that I was better. I could sit up and breathe again in a crippled way, and though I had no strength and my hands shook, I could move my arms. The eyes around me belonged to real people, the denizens of the riverside tenements. A woman brought a bowl of some hot drink. I could not be sure if it was soup or tea, only that it was scalding and somewhat salty and smelt of smoke. I pretended to drink it, and afterward found that I had slight burns on my lips and tongue. "Were you trying to do that?" Ďrot asked. "How did you come up?" I shook my head. Someone in the crowd said, "He shot right out of the water." Rosh helped me steady my hand. "We thought you'd come up somewhere else, that you were playing a joke on us." I said, "I saw Malrubius." An old man, a boatman from his tar-stained clothes, took Rosh by the shoulder. "Who's that?" "Used to be master of apprentices. He's dead." "Not a woman?" The old man was holding Rosh, but looking at me. No, Rosh told him. "There are no women in our guild." Despite the hot drink and the warmth of the day, I was cold. One of the youths we sometimes fought brought a dusty blanket, and I wrapped myself in it. But it was so long before I was strong enough to walk again that by the time we reached the gate of the necropolis, the statue of night atop the khan on the opposite bank was a minute scratch of black against the sun's field of flame, and the gate itself stood closed and locked. Chapter 3. The Autarch's Face. It was mid-morning of the next day before I thought to look at the coin Vodalus had given me. After serving the journeymen in the refectory, we had breakfast as usual. Met Master 𝛼 in our classroom, and after a brief preparatory lecture, followed him to the lower levels to view the work of the preceding night. But perhaps before I write further, I should explain something more of the nature of our Matachin Tower. It is situated toward the back of the citadel, upon the western side. At ground level are the studies of our masters, where consultations with the officers of justice and the heads of other guilds are conducted. Our common room is above them, with its back to the kitchen. Above that is the refectory, which serves us as an assembly hall as well as an eating place. Above it are the private cabins of the masters, in better days much more numerous. Above these are the journeymen's cabins, and above them the apprentices' dormitory and classroom, and a series of attics and abandoned cubicles. Near the very top is the gun room, whose remaining pieces we of the guild are charged with serving, should the citadel suffer attack. The real work of our guild is carried out below all this. Just underground lies the examination room. Beneath it, and thus outside the tower proper, for the examination room was the propulsion chamber of the original structure, stretches the labyrinth of the oubliette. There are 3 usable levels, reached by a central stairwell. The cells are plain, dry, and clean, equipped with a small table, a chair, and narrow bed fixed in the center of the floor. The lights of the oubliette are of that ancient kind that is said to burn forever, though some have now gone out. In the gloom of those corridors, my feelings that morning were not gloomy but joyous. Here I would labor when I became a journeyman. Here I would practice the ancient art and raise myself to the rank of master. Here I would lay the foundation for the restoration of our guild to its former glory. The very air of the place seemed to wrap me like a blanket that had been warmed before some clean-scented fire. We halted before the door of a cell, and the journeyman on duty rattled his key in the lock. Inside, the client lifted her head, opening dark eyes very wide. Master 𝛼 wore the sable-trimmed cloak and velvet mask of his rank. I suppose that these, or the protruding optical device that permitted him to see, must have frightened her. She did not speak, and of course, none of us spoke to her. Here, Master 𝛼 began in his driest tone. We have something outside the routine of judicial punishment and, well, illustrative of modern technique. The client was put to the question last night. Perhaps some of you heard her. 20 minims of tincture were given before the excruciation and 10 after. The dose was only partially effective in preventing shock and loss of consciousness, so the proceedings were terminated after flaying the right leg, as you will see. He gestured to Ďrot, who began unwrapping the bandages. Half boot? Rosh asked. No, full boot. She has been a maidservant, and Master Gerlo says he has found them strong-skinned. In this instance, he was proved correct. A simple circular incision was made below the knee, and its edge taken with 8 clamps. Careful work by Master Gerlos, Odo, Menas, and Aigul permitted the removal of everything between the knee and the toes without further help from the knife. We gathered around Ďrot, the younger boys pushing in as they pretended they knew the points to look for. The arteries and major veins were all intact, but there was a slow, generalized welling of blood. I helped Ďrot apply fresh dressings. Just as we were about to leave, the woman said, "I don't know. Only, oh, can't you believe? I wouldn't tell you if I did. She's gone with Vodalus of the Wood. I don't know where." Outside, feigning ignorance, I asked Master Palæmon who Vodalus of the Wood was. "How often have I explained that nothing said by a client under questioning is heard by you?" "Many times, Master, but to no effect." "Soon it will be masking day, and Ďrot and Rosh will be journeymen, and you, captain of apprentices. Is this the example you set the boys?" "No, Master." Behind the old man's back, Ďrot gave me a look that meant he knew much about Vodalus and would tell me at a convenient time. "Once the journeymen of our guild were deafened. Would you have those days again? Take your hands from your pockets when I speak to you, Severian." I had put them there because I knew it would distract his anger, but as I drew them out, I realized I had been fumbling the coin Vodalus had given me the night before. In the remembered terror of the fight, I had forgotten it. Now, I was in agony to look at it, and could not with Master Palæmon's bright lens fixed on me. "When a client speaks, Severian, you hear nothing, nothing whatsoever. Think of mice, whose squeaking conveys no meaning to men." I squinted to indicate that I was thinking of mice. All the long, weary way up the stair to our classroom, I ached to look at the thin disk of metal I clutched. But I knew that if I were to do so, the boy behind me, as it happened, one of the younger apprentices, Eusignius, would see it. In the classroom, where Master Palæmon droned over a 10-day corpse, the coin was like a coal of fire, and I dared not look. It was afternoon before I found privacy, hiding myself in the ruins of the curtain wall among the shining mosses. Then, hesitating with my fist poised in a ray of sun, because I was afraid that when I saw it at last, the disappointment would be more than I could bear. Not because I cared for its value. Though I was already a man, I had had so little money that any coin would have seemed a fortune to me. Rather, it was that the coin, so mysterious now, but not likely to remain so, was my only link with the night before, my only connection with Vodalus, and the beautiful hooded woman, and the heavy man who had struck at me with his shovel. My only booty from the fight at the opened grave. My life in the guild was the only life I had known, and it seemed as drab as my ragged shirt in comparison with the flash of the exultant sword blade and the sound of the shot echoing among the stones. All that might be gone when I opened my hand. In the end I looked, having drained the dregs of pleasant dread. The coin was a gold 꽌 and I closed my hand once more, fearing that I had only mistaken a brass orchalk, and waited until I found my courage again. It was the first time I had ever touched a piece of gold. Orichalks I had seen in some plenty, and I had even possessed a few of my own. Silver asomai I had glimpsed once or twice, but 꽌 I knew only in the same dim way I knew of the existence of a world outside our city of Nessus, and of continents other than our own to the north and east and west. This one bore what I at first thought was a woman's face, a woman crowned, neither young nor old, but silent and perfect in the citrine metal. At last I turned my treasure over, and then, indeed, I caught my breath. Stamped on the reverse was just such a flying ship as I had seen in the arms above the door of my secret mausoleum. It seemed beyond explanation. So much so that at the time I did not even trouble to speculate about it. So sure was I that any speculation would be fruitless. Instead, I thrust the coin back into my pocket and went, in a species of trance, to rejoin my fellow apprentices. To carry the coin about with me was out of the question. As soon as there was an opportunity to do so, I slipped into the necropolis alone and sought out my mausoleum. The weather had turned that day. I pushed through drenching shrubbery and trudged over long, aged grass that had begun to flatten itself for winter. When I reached my retreat, it was no longer the cool, inviting cave of summer, but an icy trap, where I sensed the nearness of enemies too vague for names. Opponents of ๊B<silence> , who surely knew by now that I was his sworn supporter. As soon as I entered, they would rush forward to swing the black door shut on newly oiled hinges. I knew that it was nonsense, of course. Yet I also knew there was truth in it, that it was a proximity in time, I felt. In a few months or a few years, I might reach the point at which those enemies waited for me. When I had swung the axe, I had chosen to fight. A thing a torturer does not normally do. There was a loose stone in the floor almost at the foot of my funeral bronze. I pried it up and put the Chrysos under it, then muttered an incantation I had learned years before from Roche, a few lines of verse that would hold hidden objects safe. Where I put you, there you lie. Never let a stranger spy. Like glass grow to any eye, not of me. Here be safe, never leave it. Should a hand come, deceive it. Let strange eyes not believe it till I see. For the charm to be really effective, one had to walk around the spot at midnight carrying a corpse candle. But I found myself laughing at the thought, which suggested Draught's mummery about simples drawn at midnight from graves, and decided to rely on the verse alone, though I was somewhat astonished to discover that I was now old enough not to be ashamed of it. Days passed, and the memory of my visit to the mausoleum remained vivid enough to dissuade me from making another to verify that my treasure was safe, though at times I longed to do so. Then came the first snow, turning the ruins of the curtain wall into an almost impassably slippery barrier, and the familiar necropolis into a strange wilderness of deceptive hummocks, in which monuments were suddenly too large under their coats of new snow, and the trees and bushes crushed to half-size by theirs. It is the nature of apprenticeship in our guild that, though easy at first, its burdens grow greater and greater as one comes to manhood. The smallest boys do not work at all. At the age of 6, when work begins, it is at first no more than running up and down the stairs of the Matachin Tower with messages, and the little apprentice, proud of being entrusted with them, hardly feels the labor. As time progresses, however, his work becomes more and more onerous. His duties take him to other parts of the citadel, to the soldiers in the Barbican, where he learns that the military apprentices have drums and trumpets and ophicleids and boots and sometimes gilded cuirasses, to the Bear Tower, where he sees boys no older than himself learning to handle wonderful fighting animals of all kinds, mastiffs with heads as large as a lion's, diatrymi, taller than a man, with beaks sheathed in steel, and to 100 other such places, where he discovers for the first time that his guild is hated and despised, even by those, indeed most of all by those, who make use of its services. Soon there is scrubbing and kitchen work. Brother Cook performs such cooking as might be interesting or pleasurable, and the apprentice is left to pare vegetables, serve the journeyman, and carry an endless succession of stacks of trays down the stairs to the oubliette. I did not know it at the time, but soon this apprentice life of mine, which had been growing harder for as long as I could remember, would reverse its course and become less drudging and more pleasant. In the year before he used to become a journeyman, a senior apprentice does little but supervise the work of his juniors. His food and even his dress improve. The younger journeymen begin to treat him almost as an equal, and he has, above all, the elevating burden of responsibility and the pleasure of issuing and enforcing orders. When his elevation comes, he is an adult. He does no work but that for which he has been trained, and he is free to leave the citadel when his duties are over, for which recreation he is supplied with liberal funds. Should he eventually rise to mastership, an honor that requires the affirmative votes of all the living masters, he will be able to pick and choose such assignments as may interest or amuse him, and direct the affairs of the guild itself. But you must understand that in the year I have been writing of, the year in which I saved the life of Vodalus, I was unconscious of all that. Winter, I was told, had ended the campaigning season in the north, and thus brought the autarch and his chief officers and advisors back to the seats of justice. And so, as Roche explained, we have all these new clients, and more to come, dozens, maybe hundreds. We might have to reopen the 4th level. He waved a freckled hand to show that he at least was ready to do whatever might be necessary. Is he here? I asked. The autarch. Here in the citadel? In the great keep? Of course not. If he ever came, you'd know it, wouldn't you? There'd be parades and inspections and all kinds of goings-on. There's a suite for him there, but the door hasn't been opened in 100 years. He'll be in the hidden palace, the 𝙼𝙬, north of the city someplace. Don't you know where? Roche grew defensive. You can't say where it is because there's nothing there except the 𝙼𝙬 itself. It's where it is. To the north, on the other bank. Beyond the wall? He smiled on my ignorance. Far past it. Weeks if you walked. Naturally, the autarch could get here by flyer in an instant if he wanted to. The flag tower? That's where the flyer would land. But our new clients did not come in flyers. The less important arrived in coffles of 10 to 20 men and women, chained one behind the other by the neck. They were guarded by demarchi, hard-bitten troopers in armor that looked as if it had been made for use and used. Each client carried a copper cylinder supposedly containing his or her papers, and thus his or her fate. All of them had broken the seals and read those papers, of course, and some had destroyed them or exchanged them for another's. Those who arrived without papers would be held until some further word concerning their disposition was received, probably for the remainder of their lives. Those who had exchanged papers with someone else had exchanged fates. They would be held or released, tortured or executed in another's stead. The more important arrived in armored carriages. The steel sides and barred windows of these vehicles were not intended to prevent escape, so much as to thwart rescue. And no sooner had the first of them thundered around the east side of the witch's tower and entered the old yard than the whole guild was filled with rumors of daring raids contemplated or attempted by Vodalus. For all my fellow apprentices and most of the journeymen believed that many of these clients were his henchmen, confederates, and allies. I would not have released them for that reason. It would have brought disgrace on the guild, which for all my attachment to him and his movement I was unready to do, and would have been impossible anyway. But I hoped to provide those I considered my comrades in arms with such small comforts as lay within my power. Extra food, stolen from the trays of less deserving clients, and occasionally a bit of meat smuggled from the kitchen. One blustering day, I was given the opportunity to learn who they were. I was scrubbing the floor in Master Ģirlos's study when he was called away on some errand, leaving his table stacked with newly arrived dossiers. I hurried over as soon as the door had clanged behind him, and was able to skim most of them before I heard his heavy tread on the stair again. Not one of the prisoners whose papers I had read had been an adherent of Vodalus. There were merchants who had tried to make rich profits on supplies needed by the army, camp followers who had spied for the Ascians, and a sprinkling of sordid civil criminals. Nothing else. When I carried my bucket out to empty in the stone sink in the old yard, I saw one of the armored carriages halted there with its long-maned team steaming and stamping, and the guards in their fur-trimmed helmets sheepishly accepting our smoking goblets of mulled wine. I caught the name Vodalus in the air, but at that moment it seemed I was the only one who heard it, and suddenly I felt Vodalus had been only an eidolon created by my imagination from the fog, and only the man I had slain with his own axe real. The dossiers I had fumbled through a moment before seemed blown like leaves against my face. It was in this instant of confusion that I realized for the first time that I am, in some degree, insane. It could be argued that it was the most harrowing of my life. I had lied often to Master Ģirlos and Master Palæmon, to Master Malrubius while he still lived, to Drought because he was captain, to Roche because he was older and stronger than I, and to Ita and the other smaller apprentices because I hoped to make them respect me. Now I could no longer be sure my own mind was not lying to me. All my falsehoods were recoiling on me, and I, who remembered everything, could not be certain those memories were more than my own dreams. I recalled the moonlit face of Vodalus, but then I had wanted to see it. I recalled his voice as he spoke to me, but I had desired to hear it, and the woman's voice too. One freezing night, I crept back to the mausoleum and took out the Chrysos again. The worn, serene, androgynous face on its obverse was not the face of Vodalus. Chapter 4. Triskel. I had been poking a stick up a frozen drain as punishment for some petty infraction, and I found him where the keepers of the bear tower throw their refuse, the bodies of the torn animals killed in practice. Our guild buries its own dead beside the wall, and our clients in the lower reaches of the necropolis. But the keepers of the bear tower leave theirs to be taken away by others. He was the smallest of those dead. There are encounters that change nothing. Earth turns her aged face to the sun, and he beams upon her snows. They scintillate and coruscate until each little point of ice, hanging from the swelling sides of the towers, seems the claw of the conciliator, the most precious of gems. Then everyone, except the wisest, believes that the snow must melt and give way to a protracted summer beyond summer. Nothing of the sort occurs. The paradise endures for a watch or two. Then shadows, blue as watered milk, lengthen on the snow, which shifts and dances under the spur of an east wind. Night comes, and all is as it was. My finding Triskell was like that. I felt that it could have and should have changed everything, but it was only the episode of a few months, and when it was over and he was gone, it was only another winter passed, and the feast of Holy Catherine come again, and nothing had changed. I wish I could tell you how pitiful he looked when I touched him, and how cheerful. He lay on his side covered with blood. It was as hard as tar in the cold, and still bright red, because the cold had preserved it. I went over and put my hand on his head, I don't know why. He seemed as dead as the rest, but he opened one eye then, and rolled it at me. And there was a confidence in it that the worst was over now. I have carried my part, it seemed to say, and borne up, and done all I could do. Now it is your turn to do your duty by me. If it had been summer, I think I would have let him die. As it was, I had not seen a living animal, not so much as a garbage-eating Ʞ🗫 in some time. I stroked him again, and he licked my hand, and I could not turn away after that. I picked him up, surprised at how heavy he was, and looked about trying to decide what to do with him. He would be discovered in our dormitory before the candle had burned a finger's width, I knew. The citadel is immense and immensely complicated, with little visited rooms and passages in its towers, in the buildings that have been erected between the towers, and in the galleries delved under them. Yet I could not think of any such place that I could reach without being seen half a dozen times on the way. And in the end, I carried the poor brute into the quarters of our own guild. I then had to get him past the journeymen who stood guard at the head of the stair leading to the cell tiers. My first idea was to put him in the basket in which we took down the client's clean bedding. It was a laundry day, and it would have been easy enough to make one more trip than was actually required. The chance that the journeyman guard would notice anything amiss seemed remote, but it would have involved waiting more than a watch for the scrubbed linen to dry, and risking the questions of the brother on duty in the third tier, who would see me descending to the deserted fourth. Instead, I laid the dog in the examination room. He was too weak to move, and offered to take the guard's place at the head of the ramp. He was happy enough to seize the opportunity to relieve himself, and handed over his wide-bladed carnificial sword, which I, in theory, was not supposed to touch, and his Ʞ🗼ᴜᴜ cloak, which I was forbidden to wear, though I was already taller than most of the journeymen, so that from a distance it would appear that there had been no substitution. I put on the cloak, and as soon as he was gone, stood the sword in a corner and got my dog. All our guild cloaks are voluminous, and this one was more so than most, since the brother I had replaced was large of frame. Furthermore, the hue Ʞ🗼ᴜᴜ, which is darker than black, admirably erases all folds, bunchings, and gatherings so far as the eye is concerned, showing only a featureless dark. With the hood pulled up, I must have appeared to the journeymen at their tables in the tiers, if they looked toward the stair and saw me at all, as a brother, somewhat more portly than most descending to the lower levels. Even the men on duty in the third, where the clients who had lost all reason howled and shook their chains, could have seen nothing unusual in another journeyman going down to the fourth when there were rumors that it was to be refurbished, or in an apprentice running down shortly after the journeyman went up again. No doubt he had forgotten something there, and the apprentice had been sent to fetch it. It was not a prepossessing place. About half of the old light still burned, but mud had seeped into the corridors until it lay to the thickness of one's hand. A duty table stood where it had been left, perhaps 200 years before. The wood had rotted, and the whole thing fell at a touch. Yet the water had never been high here, and the farther end of the corridor I chose was free even of the mud. I laid my dog on a client's bed and cleaned him as well as I could with sponges I had carried down from the examination room. Under the crusted blood, his fur was short, stiff, and tawny. His tail had been cut so short that what remained was wider than it was long. His ears had been cut almost completely away, leaving only stiff points shorter than the first joint of my thumb. In his last fight, his chest had been laid open. I could see the wide muscles like drowsy constrictors of pale red. His right foreleg was gone, the upper half crushed to a pulp. I cut it away after I had sutured up his chest as well as I could, and it began to bleed again. I found the artery and tied it, then folded the skin under, as Master Ḥpalā:men had taught us, to make a neat stump. ᴘᴏᴜᴜ licked my hand from time to time as I worked, and when I had made the last stitch, began slowly licking that, as if he were a bear to lick a new leg into shape. His jaws were as big as an archon's, and his canines as long as my index finger, but his gums were white. There was no more strength in those jaws now than in a skeleton's hands. His eyes were yellow and had a certain clean madness. That evening I traded tasks with the boy who was to bring the clients their meals. There were always extra trays because some clients would not eat, and now I carried 2 of these down to ᴘᴜᴜ, wondering if he was still alive. He was. He had somehow climbed out of the bed where I had laid him and crawled, he could not stand, to the edge of the mud where a little water had gathered. That was where I found him. There was soup and dark bread and 2 carafes of water. He drank 1 bowl of soup, but when I tried to feed him the bread, I found he could not chew it enough to swallow. I soaked it in the other bowl of soup for him, then filled the bowl again and again with water until both carafes were empty. When I lay on my cot almost at the top of our tower, I thought that I could hear his labored breathing. Several times I sat up listening. Each time the sound faded away, only to return when I had lain flat for a time. Perhaps it was only the beating of my heart. If I had found him 1 year, 2 years before, he would have been a divinity to me. I would have told Ďrāt and the rest, and he would have been a divinity to us all. Now I knew him for the poor animal he was, and yet I could not let him die because it would have been a breaking of faith with something in myself. I had been a man, if I was truly a man, such a short time. I could not endure to think that I had become a man so different from the boy I had been. I could remember each moment of my past, every vagrant thought and sight, every dream. How could I destroy that past? I held up my hands and tried to look at them. I knew the veins stood out in their backs now. It is when those veins stand out that one is a man. In a dream, I walked through the 4th level again and found a huge friend there with dripping jaws. it spoke to me. Next morning, I served the clients again and stole food to take down to the dog, though I hoped that he was dead. He was not. He lifted his muzzle and seemed to grin at me, with a mouth so wide it appeared his head might fall in two halves, though he did not try to stand. I fed him, and as I was about to leave, was struck by the misery of his condition. He was dependent on me. Me. He had been valued. Trainers had coached him as runners are coached for a race. He had walked in pride, his enormous chest as wide as a man's, set on two legs like pillars. Now he lived like a ghost. His very name had been washed away in his own blood. When I had time, I visited the Bear Tower and struck up such friendships as I could with the beast handlers there. They have their own guild, and though it is a lesser guild than ours, it has much strange lore. To a degree that astonished me, I found it to be the same lore, though I did not, of course, penetrate to their arcanum. In the elevation of their masters, the candidate stands under a metal grate trod by a bleeding bull. At some point in life, each brother takes a lioness or bear sow in marriage, after which he shuns human women. All of which is only to say that there exists between them and the animals they bring to the pits a bond, much like that between our clients and ourselves. Now I have traveled much farther from our tower, but I have found always that the pattern of our guild is repeated mindlessly, like the repetitions of Father Anir's mirrors in the House Absolute, in the societies of every trade, so that they are all of them torturers, just as we. His quarry stands to the hunter as our clients to us, those who buy to the tradesman, the enemies of the Commonwealth to the soldier, the governed to the governors, men to women. All love that which they destroy. A week after I had carried him down, I found only Triskel's hobbling footprints in the mud. He was gone, but I set out after him, sure that one of the journeymen would have mentioned it to me if he had come up the ramp. Soon the footprints led to a narrow door that opened on a welter of lightless corridors, of whose existence I had been utterly unaware. In the dark, I could no longer track him, but I pressed on nevertheless, thinking that he might catch my scent in the stale air and come to me. Soon I was lost, and went forward only because I did not know how to go back. I have no way of knowing how old those tunnels are. I suspect, though I can hardly say why, that they antedate the citadel above them, ancient though it is. It comes to us from the very end of the age when the urge to flight, the outward urge that sought new suns, not ours, remained, though the means to achieve that flight were sinking like dying fires. Remote as that time is, from which hardly one name is recalled, we still remember it. Before it, there must have been another time, a time of burrowing, of the creation of dark galleries that is now utterly forgotten. However that may be, I was frightened there. I ran, and sometimes ran into walls, until at last I saw a spot of pale daylight and clambered out through a hole hardly big enough for my head and shoulders. I found myself crawling onto the ice-covered pedestal of one of those old faceted dials whose multitudinous faces give each a different time, no doubt because the frost of these latter ages entering the tunnel below had heaved its foundation. It had slipped sidewise until it stood at such an angle that it might have been one of its own gnomons, drawing the silent passage of the short winter day across the unmarked snow. The space about it had been a garden in summer, but not such a one as our necropolis, with half-wild trees and rolling meadowed lawns. Roses had blossomed here in craters, set upon a tessellated pavement. Statues of beasts stood with their backs to the four walls of the court, eyes turned to watch the canted dial. Hulking barolambdas, arctothers, the monarchs of bears, glyptodons, smilodons with fangs like glaives. All were dusted now with snow. I looked for Triskel's tracks, but he had not come here. The walls of the court held high, narrow windows. I could see no light through them and no motion. The spear towers of the citadel rose on every side, so that I knew I had not left it. Instead, I seemed to be somewhere near its heart, where I had never been. Shaking with cold, I crossed to the nearest door and pounded on it. I had the feeling that I might wander forever in the tunnels below without ever finding another way to the surface. And I was resolved to smash one of the windows, if need be, rather than return that way. There was no sound within, though I beat my fist against the door panels again and again. There is really no describing the sensation of being watched. I have heard it called a prickling at the back of the neck, and even a consciousness of eyes that seem to float in darkness. But it is neither, at least not for me. It is something akin to a sourceless embarrassment, coupled with the feeling that I must not turn around, because to turn will be to appear a fool, answering the promptings of baseless intuition. Eventually, of course, one does. I turned, with the vague impression that someone had followed me through the hole at the base of the dial. Instead, I saw a young woman, wrapped in furs, standing before a door at the opposite side of the court. I waved to her and began to walk toward her, hurriedly because I was so cold. She advanced toward me then, and we met on the farther side of the dial. She asked who I was and what I was doing there, and I told her as well as I could. The face, circled by her fur hood, was exquisitely molded, and the hood itself and her coat and fur-trimmed boots were soft-looking and rich, so that I was miserably conscious, as I spoke to her, of my own patched shirt and trousers, and my muddy feet. Her name was Valeria. "We do not have your dog here," she said. "You may search if you do not believe me." "I never thought you did. I only want to go back where I belong, to the Madachin Tower, without having to go down there again." "You're very brave. I have seen that hole since I was a little girl, but I never dared go in." "I'd like to go in," I said. "I mean, inside there." She opened the door through which she had come and led me into a tapestried room where stiff ancient chairs seemed as fixed in their places as the statues in the frozen court. A diminutive fire smoked in a grate against one wall. We went to it, and she took off her coat while I spread my hands to the warmth. "Wasn't it cold in the tunnels?" "Not as cold as outside. Besides, I was running and there was no wind." "I see. How strange that they should come up in the atrium of time." She looked younger than I, but there was an antique quality about her metal-trimmed dress and the shadow of her dark hair that made her seem older than Master Palimon, a dweller in forgotten yesterdays. "Is that what you call it? The atrium of time? Because of the dials, I suppose." No, the dials were put there because we call it that. Do you like the dead languages? They have mottos. Luxte vitae viam monstrat. That's the beam of the new sun lights the way of life. Felicibus brevis, miseris hora longa. Men wait long for happiness. Aspice ut aspiciar. I had to tell her with some shame that I knew no tongue beyond the one we spoke, and little of that. Before I left, we talked a century's watch or more. Her family occupied these towers. They had waited at first to leave Earth with the autarch of their era. Then had waited because there was nothing left for them but waiting. They had given many castellans to the citadel, but the last had died generations ago. They were poor now, and their towers were in ruins. Valeria had never gone above the lower floors. Some of the towers were built more strongly than others, I said. The witch's keep is decayed inside, too. Is there really such a place? My nurse told me of it when I was little, to frighten me, but I thought it was only a tale. There was supposed to be a tower of torment, too, where all who entered die in agony. I told her that at least was a fable. The great days of these towers are more fabulous to me, she said. No one of my blood carries a sword now against the enemies of the Commonwealth, or stands hostage for us at the Well of Orchids. Perhaps one of your sisters will be summoned soon, I said, for I did not want, for some reason, to think of her going herself. I am all the sisters we breed, she answered, and all the sons. An old servant brought us tea and small hard cakes. Not real tea, but the maté of the north, which we sometimes give our clients because it is so cheap. Valeria smiled. You see, you have found some comfort here. You are worried about your poor dog because he is lame, but he too may have found hospitality. You love him, so another may love him. You love him, so you may love another. I agreed, but secretly thought that I would never have another dog, which has proved true. I did not see ᴧᴗᴜ again for almost a week. Then one day, as I was carrying a letter to the Barbican, he came bounding up to me. He had learned to run on his single front leg, like an acrobat who does handstands on a gilded ball. After that, I saw him once or twice a month for as long as the snow lasted. I never knew whom he had found, who was feeding him and caring for him, but I like to think it was someone who took him away with him in the spring, perhaps north to the cities of tents and the campaigns among the mountains. Chapter 5. The Picture Cleaner and Others. The Feast of Holy Catherine is the greatest of days for our guild, the festival by which we are recalled to our heritage, the time when journeymen become masters, if they ever do, and apprentices become journeymen. I will leave my description of the ceremonies of that day until I have occasion to tell of my own elevation. But in the year I am recounting, the year of the fight by the graveside, Ðrot and Roche were elevated, leaving me captain of apprentices. The full weight of that office did not impress itself on me until the ritual was nearly over. I was sitting in the ruined chapel enjoying the pageantry, and only just conscious, in the same pleasant way I was anticipating the feast, that I would be senior to all the rest when the last of it was done. By slow degrees, however, a feeling of disquiet seized me. I was miserable before I knew I was no longer happy, and bowed with responsibility when I did not yet fully understand I held it. I remembered how much difficulty 귲 had encountered in keeping us in order. I would have to do it now without his strength, and with no one to be to me what Roche had been to him, a lieutenant of his own age. When the final chant crashed to a close, and Master Gerlos and Master Palimon in their gold-traced masks had slow-stepped through the door, and the old journeymen had hoisted 귲 and Roche, the new journeymen, on their shoulders, already fumbling in the saber-tashes at their belts for the fireworks they would set off outside, I had steeled myself and even formed a rudimentary plan. We apprentices were to serve the feast, and before we did so, were to doff the relatively new and clean clothes we had been given for the ceremony. After the last cracker had popped, and the matrosses, in their annual gesture of amity, had torn the sky with the largest piece of ordnance in the great keep, I hustled my charges, already, or so I thought, beginning to look at me resentfully, back to our dormitory, closed the door, and pushed a cot against it. Ita was the oldest, except for myself, and, fortunately for me, I had been friendly enough in the past that he suspected nothing until it was too late to make effective resistance. I got him by the throat and banged his head half a dozen times against the bulkhead, then kicked his feet from under him. "Now," I said, "are you going to be my second? Answer!" He could not speak, but he nodded. "Good. I'll get Timon. You take the next biggest." In the space of 100 breaths, and very quick breaths they were, the boys had been kicked into submission. It was 3 weeks before any of them dared to disobey me, and then there was no mass rebellion, only individual malingering. As captain of apprentices, I had new functions, as well as more freedom than I had ever enjoyed before. It was I who saw that the journeymen on duty got their meals hot, and who supervised the boys who toiled under the stacks of trays intended for our clients. In the kitchen, I drove my charges to their tasks, and in the classroom, I coached them in their studies. I was employed, to a much greater degree than previously, in carrying messages to distant parts of the citadel, and even in a small way, in conducting the guild's business. Thus I became acquainted with all the thoroughfares, and with many an unfrequented corner. Granaries with lofty bins and demonic cats, wind-swept ramparts overlooking gangrenous slums, and the Pinacothekon, with their great hallway topped by a vaulted roof of window-pierced brick, floored with flagstones strewn with carpets, and bound by walls from which dark arches opened to strings of chambers lined, as the hallway itself was, with innumerable pictures. Many of these were so old and smoke-grimed that I could not discern their subjects, and there were others whose meaning I could not guess. A dancer whose wings seemed leeches, a silent-looking woman who gripped a double-bladed dagger and sat beneath a mortuary mask. After I had walked at least a league among these enigmatic paintings one day, I came upon an old man perched on a high ladder. I wanted to ask my way, but he seemed so absorbed in his work that I hesitated to disturb him. The picture he was cleaning showed an armored figure standing in a desolate landscape. It had no weapon, but held a staff bearing a strange, stiff banner. The visor of this figure's helmet was entirely of gold, without eye slits or ventilation. In its polished surface, the deathly desert could be seen in reflection, and nothing more. This warrior of a dead world affected me deeply, though I could not say why or even just what emotion it was I felt. in some obscure way, I wanted to take down the picture and carry it, not into our necropolis, but into one of those mountain forests of which our necropolis was. As I understood even then, an idealized but vitiated image. It should have stood among trees, the edge of its frame resting on young grass. And so, a voice behind me said, they all escaped. Vodalus had what he had come for, you see. You, snapped the other. What are you doing here? I turned and saw two armigers dressed in bright clothes that came as near to exultants as they dared have them. I said, I have a communication for the archivist, and held up the envelope. Very well, said the armiger who had spoken to me. Do you know the location of the archives? I was about to ask Sir. Then you are not the proper messenger to take the letter, are you? Give it to me and I'll give it to a page. I can't, Sir. It is my task to deliver it. The other armiger said, You needn't be so hard on this young man, Racho. You don't know what he is, do you? And you do? The one called Racho nodded. From what part of this citadel are you, messenger? From the Matachin Tower. Master Gerlo sends me to the archivist. The other armiger's face tightened. You are a torturer, then? Only an apprentice, sir. I don't wonder, then, that my friend wants you out of his sight. Follow the gallery to the third door, make your turn and continue about 100 paces, climb the stair to the second landing, and take the corridor south to the double doors at the end. Thank you, I said, and took a step in the direction he had indicated. Wait a bit. If you go now, we'll have to look at you. Racho said, I'd as soon have him ahead of us as behind us. I waited nonetheless, with one hand resting on the leg of the ladder, for the two of them to turn a corner. Like one of those half-spiritual friends who in dreams addresses us from the clouds, the old man said, So you're a torturer, are you? Do you know I've never been to your place? He had a weak glance, reminding me of the turtles we sometimes frightened on the banks of 𝙾, and a nose and chin that nearly met. Grant I never see you there, I said politely. Nothing to fear now. What could you do with a man like me? My heart would stop like that. He dropped his sponge into his bucket and attempted to snap his wet fingers, though no sound came. Know where it is, though. Behind the witch's keep. Isn't that right? Yes, I said, a trifle surprised that the witches were better known than we. Thought so. Nobody never talks about it, though. You're angry about those armigers, and I don't blame you. But you ought to know how it is with them. They're supposed to be like exultants, only they're not. They're afraid to die, afraid to hurt, and afraid to act like it. It's hard on them. They should be done away with, I said. Vodalus would set them quarrying. They're only a carryover from some past age. What possible help can they give the world? The old man cocked his head. Why, what help was they to begin? Do you know? When I admitted I did not, he scrambled down from the ladder like an aged monkey, seeming all arms and legs and wrinkled neck. His hands were as long as my feet, the crooked fingers laced with blue veins. I'm 𝙻, the curator. You know old Ultan, I take it? No, of course not. If you did, you'd know the way to the library. I said, I've never been in this part of the citadel before. Never been here. Why, this is the best part. Art, music, and books. We've a fetch in here that shows 3 girls dressing another one with flowers that's so real, you expect the bees to come out of it. A 꽤ᴜᴜᴜᴜ, too. Not popular anymore, 꽤ᴜᴜᴜ isn't, or we wouldn't have him here. But the day he was born, he was a better draftsman than the drippers and spitters they're wild for today. We get what the house absolute don't want, you see? That means we get the old ones, and they're the best, mostly. Come in here dirty from having hung so long, and I cleaned them up. Sometimes I clean them again, after they've hung here a time. We've got a fetch in here. It's the truth. Or you take this one now. Like it? It seemed safe to say I did. Third time for it. When I was new come, I was old 꽠ᴏᴜᴜᴜ's apprentice, and he taught me how to clean. This was the one he used, because he said it wasn't worth nothing. He begun down here in this corner. When he'd done about as much as you could cover with one hand, he turned it over to me, and I did the rest. Back when my wife still lived, I cleaned it again. That would be after our second girl was born. It wasn't all that dark, but I had things in my mind and wanted something to do. Today, I took the notion to clean it again. And it needs it. See how nice it's brightening up? There's your blue earth coming over his shoulder again, fresh as the autarch's fish. All this time, the name of Vodalus was echoing in my mind. I felt certain the old man had come down from his ladder only because I had mentioned it, and I wanted to ask him about it. But try as I might, I could find no way to bring the conversation around to it. When I had been silent a moment too long and was afraid he was about to mount his ladder and begin cleaning again, I managed to say, "Is that the moon? I have been told it's more fertile." "Now it is, yes. This was done before they got it irrigated. See that gray-brown? In those times, that's what you'd see if you looked up at her. Not green like she is now. Didn't seem so big either, because it wasn't so close in. That's what old 꽠ᴜᴜᴜ used to say. Now there's trees enough on it to hide Nilamon, as the saw goes." I seized my opportunity. "Or Vodalus." ᴫᴜᴜᴜ cackled. "Or him, that's right enough. Your bunch must be rubbing their hands waiting to have him. Got something special planned?" If the guild had particular excruciations reserved for specific individuals, I knew nothing of it. But I endeavored to look wise and said, "We'll think of something." "I suppose you will. A bit ago, though, I thought you was for him. Still, you'll have to wait if he's hiding in the forests of Lune." ᴫᴜᴜᴜ looked up at the picture with obvious appreciation before turning back to me. "I'm forgetting, you want to visit our master Ultan. Go back to that arch you just come by." "I know the way," I said. "The armiger told me." The old curator blew those directions to the winds with a puff of sour breath. "What he laid down would only get you to the reading room. From there it'd take you a watch to get to Ultan, if ever you did. No, step back to that arch. Go through and all the way to the end of the big room there and down the stair. You'll come to a locked door. Pound till somebody lets you in. That's the bottom of the stacks, and that's where Ultan has his study." Since ᴫᴜᴜᴜ was watching, I followed his directions, though I had not liked the part about the locked door, and steps downward suggested I might be nearing those ancient tunnels where I had wandered looking for Triskel. On the whole, I felt far less confident than when I was in those parts of the citadel that I knew. I have learned since that strangers who visit it are awed by its size, but it is only a moat in the city spread about it. And we who grew up within the grey curtain wall and have learned the names and relationships of the 100 or so landmarks necessary to those who would find their way in it, are by that very knowledge discomfited when we find ourselves away from the familiar regions. So it was with me as I walked through the arch the old man had indicated. Like the rest of that vaulted hall, it was of dull reddish brick, but it was upheld by two pillars whose capitals bore the faces of sleepers, and I found the silent lips and pale closed eyes more terrible than the agonized masks painted on the metal of our own tower. Each picture in the room beyond contained a book. Sometimes there were many or prominent. Some I had to study for some time before I saw the corner of a binding thrusting from the pocket of a woman's skirt, or realized that some strangely wrought spool held words spun like thread. The steps were narrow and steep and without railings. They twisted as they descended, so that I had not gone down more than 30 before the light of the room above was nearly cut off. At last, I was forced to put my hands before me and feel my way, for fear I would break my head in the door. My questing fingers never encountered it. Instead, the steps ended, and I nearly fell in stepping off a step that was not there, and I was left to grope across an uneven floor in total darkness.
"Who's there?"
A voice called. It was a strangely resonant one, like the sound of a bell tolled inside a cave. Chapter 6.